Hey everybody, it's Pastor Brian Flammy from Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Roswell, New Mexico. Today I'm going to attempt the impossible. I'm going to try to cram about 700 years worth of church history into about 30 minutes. I'm going to fail. This is how it's going to be. There's just too much to say, there's too much going on, and yet we're going to take a stab today at the Middle Ages. Hey, first of all, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been joining me on these videos, all 20 of you out there. Your views and your likes are much, much appreciated. So thank you. Thank you so much. We're 7 weeks into this class, and we have 3 weeks after this. And if you also have questions or comments, other things you would like to add for the sake of discussion, by all means, please let me know in the comments section. So today we're talking about the medieval church. Here's our timeline. As you can see, the end of the patristic era coincides with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the beginnings of the spread of Islam. Islam spread all over the Arabian Peninsula, into Egypt and across North Africa, north into Asia Minor. It threatened Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire. And even at the height of its expansion, it had taken the Iberian Peninsula, today known as Spain. And all of this caused great anxiety and fear among the Christians in both the East and the West. Around this same time, in the 700s to the 800s, we have the iconoclastic controversy. It turns out that some of the theologians and the rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire were very concerned that the people were not just using the images as aids for devotion and worship, but in fact they were looking at the images as if they were their gods, to worship them, to treat them idolatrously, almost in a magical way. And for that reason, many of the icons were taken away for a long time, or hidden away, until finally the controversy was resolved in favor of having the icons, but making sure that people did not treat them idolatrously. Nevertheless, it was still thought, especially in the East, that the icons and the reverence and the veneration of the icons was a conveyance of real grace. And I'll let you do with that as you want. Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800, which brings a bright spot to what many scholars call the Dark Ages, and he is the founder of the Holy Roman Empire. And there's so much we could say about Charlemagne's reign. Not only was it good politically and economically for a short while there in Western Europe, but it was also a time when theology started to get its footing again, after a lot of the chaos that had happened after the fall of the West. St. Anselm of Canterbury was one of the premier theologians of the Middle Ages and helped to bring about scholasticism as we know it. Sadly, in 1054, the Eastern and the Western churches split. Why did they split? Over the issue of the filioque, or that in the West, as part of our confessed creed during the divine service, we would say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, together with the fears of the power-hungry Pope in Rome. The East and the West realized they had irreconcilable differences. The Patriarch and the Pope, they excommunicated each other, and that schisms lasted until today. Now, around 1095, the Crusades begin, and we'll speak more about that and the purposes behind the Crusades. In 1140, Peter Lombard writes his Sentences, and this shows us the direction of scholasticism, this medieval way of doing theology. The Fourth Lateran Council helps to make the Roman Church as we know it today, especially when it comes to articular confession, and also the fact that you have to go through confession, be absolved by the priest, do penance before you can come and receive communion. You have to do this at least once a year to be considered a Roman Catholic in good standing. Then, of course, Thomas Aquinas. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about him, one of my favorite theologians in the Middle Ages, one of the most brilliant theological minds of all time. In the same way as great architectural wonders were being built at that time to the glory and praise of God, the cathedrals and the basilicas throughout Europe, so also St. Thomas Aquinas built a cathedral of the mind to the glory and praise of God. However, his realism was challenged by the nominalism of men like William of Ockham and John Duns Scotus, and their via moderna way of doing theology. By 1300, we have the rise of humanism, which is an answer to the scholasticism that had taken a hold of the medieval church at that time. And then by 1450 of the beginnings of the Renaissance. That is a huge span of history. And like I said, we're never going to do this justice, but let's dive into the specifics of this timeline. Now, when I was reading this book on the history of theology, this Swedish scholar made the argument that Gregory the Great sets the stage for medieval Christianity. He was elected Pope in 590, and already at that point he could see that times were going to be dark and tough. And so he said concerning the church that it's an old ship, hard beset by the waves, pressed about on all sides by heavy seas. The screeching and the rotting planks warn us of shipwreck ahead. How's that for a joyful, optimistic assessment? Well, he tried to shore up as much as he could many of the theological disputes and arguments that were happening at the time. And he also helped to make popular this idea of preparatory grace, that grace comes to you and prepares you to strive towards salvation. You could think of this as a continuation of maybe a semi-Pelagian position. Your good works results in merit, and the good works of others result in merits. And those merits are credited to you and can be credited to other people. The Lord's Supper during this time takes on the hues of a propitiatory sacrifice mysteriously offered to the Father or repeated bloodlessly to gain the Father's favor for us poor sinners here on earth. And like I said before, the merits that were earned through good works or the sacrifice of the Mass, these could be applied not only to yourself but to others. Now let's talk a little bit about penance and purgatory during the Middle Ages. This is a continuation of the question, like, what do we do with our sins after baptism? Should we hold off being baptized so that way I don't fall into the trap of being baptized, falling into sin? Now I've destroyed the grace of baptism. Well, it turns out in the early church, if your sins were manifest in public, there was a practice called public penance, where you had to show contrition and sorrow over your public and manifest sin. You were set apart from the rest of the congregation. And then after a prescribed time and after visible mourning and sadness over your separation from the Holy Christian Church, you were absolved and reinstated into the Holy Communion of the saints. However, because penance was considered to be a practice to be performed only once, a lot of people would do what they did with baptism during the ancient church, and that is they'd postpone it until the end of their life. Well, it turns out that in the British Isles, up in Ireland and in England, they started practicing penance not only once for very gross sin, but they started to practice it more frequently for even private sins that nobody else knew about. And the priest saw this as a way of doing pastoral care, of easing the conscience of people who desired to come to the Holy Communion. And this practice of articulating your sins, receiving absolution from the priest, and giving a chore or a list of penances or penalties to perform, this spread south into the continental Europe and soon became very popular and became the practice of the medieval church. Now, penance, why is this necessary on the part of the people, even with private sins? Because it was thought that all the sins that you commit, even though the eternal guilt has been remitted by the sacrifice of Jesus, nevertheless, your sins carry temporal consequences. And those temporal consequences are credited against you and make you unfit and unworthy to stand before God in heaven. So that debt has to be paid before you finally enter into the presence of God and see your Lord face to face. Now, what happens if you die with this debt? Well, then you have to go to purgatory. Some of our Lutheran fathers said that the doctrine of purgatory was less something that could be proven from the scriptures or from antiquity, but rather it was an answer to this question that was proposed, that what do we do with people who have temporal guilt when they die and they haven't yet made satisfaction for it? Well, that the uncleanliness and the stain of sin upon their souls needs to be burned away in the fires of purgatory. And your time in purgatory of course, can be shortened because of the merits of others that are credited to you, either through the saying of a Mass or through the prayers of others, that the superabundance of merits that belong to one or more of the saints would be given to you to speed you along through the purifying fires of purgatory. And so prayers of thanks of the dead, this is according to Martin Chemnitz, our Lutheran father, that were very common in the earliest days of the church. This quickly became prayers for the dead, that the prayers were thought to speed people from their earthly estate to their heavenly glory. And the merits of the saints, like I said in the Mass, were soon credited to these souls as speeding them on their way of pushing them through the cleansing fire of purgatory until they reach their heavenly destination and they are completely purified from sin. Now, Martin Chemnitz, part of the second generation of reformers and a principal author of the Formula of Concord, he says this concerning penance in purgatory. Since, therefore, prayer and offering for the dead is a tradition of uncertain origin, and since the other observances, among which also this one is reckoned by Tertullian, have long fallen into disuse as being obsolete, in no way is prayer and offering for the dead a necessary dogma or article of faith. Much less can purgatory as an article of faith be proved from it. For an effect cannot be better or more excellent than its cause. If you're ever interested in learning more about Martin Chemnitz's particular research into the topic of penance and purgatory, I encourage you to check out, I believe it's the third volume of his examination of the Council of Trent. It is absolutely excellent and very informative. He even goes through the typical texts that are still cited by Roman Catholic apologists to this day when they talk about the reality or the existence of purgatory from the Scriptures. There's a place in 2 Maccabees. Maybe they try to bring in the rich man and Lazarus. Well, Martin Chemnitz deals wonderfully with all of those particulars. For us and for our purposes, let's move on to the sacrifice of the Mass. This came about because there was some confusion as to the nature of the Lord's Supper. Now, is the Lord's Supper a gift from heaven that is to be received, or is this, in fact, something to be performed? And if it's performed in the context of the Christian gathering of worship, is this a meritorious work? Well, that actually became the dominant position within the medieval church. And under the influence of Aristotelian terms and categories in scholasticism, the way they explained the presence of Jesus in the sacrament was through transubstantiation, that the outward form of bread and wine were there, but the true substance had been changed from bread to body and from wine to blood. Now, the priest was seen as a man endowed with the spiritual capacity to effect the change when he says the words, and thus he offers bloodless sacrifice of Jesus' body and blood to God, which gains the favor of God for those who are there, for those for whom the Mass is being said. It quickly became the practice that the cup was withheld from the laity, and admittance to the supper, again, was only allowed, and this is by the High Middle Ages, for those who had confessed, did penance, and were absolved, and it had to be done once a year for you to be a member of good standing. Now, because of this, it turns out that many people did not go to communion every week, even though communion was, how shall we say it, offered every week, or the Mass was performed every week. Instead, many of the people would gather into their church, into their cathedral, and they would witness the elevation of the host, right? The propitiatory act on the part of the priest to gain God's favor. And being there and seeing the host elevated, it was thought that they were participating in this sacrifice to God, and they were receiving the benefit or the merit of it just by being there and watching it, not necessarily in receiving the supper. As you can imagine, this is problematic. The Crusades, everybody wants to talk about the Crusades. The Crusades were Christianity's response to the Muslims cutting off access to Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land. The first crusade was declared by Pope Urban II, who said, how can we let these Saracens retain control over the place where Jesus was buried and rose again, where he was crucified for the sins of the world? It is necessary for us. In fact, God wills it that we go and take these lands for ourselves. Now, the First Crusade, by the way, was the only successful crusade, and only for a short while before the Crusaders were driven out. But they did, in fact, secure Jerusalem, established a kingdom of Jerusalem, and reopened the pilgrimage routes so that the Christian pilgrims could get to the Holy Land and see the places where Christ was crucified, died, where he was raised, and where he rose and ascended to the Father, right? The Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, it became less about achieving the lofty goals of the First Crusade and more about plunder, especially since the Fourth Crusade pretty much sacked Constantinople. Maybe, and do you think this helped the Eastern Christians feel any better about the Western Christians? No, not really. What were some of the negatives of the Crusades? Well, their objectives were not obtained and held. Islam was not curbed and driven back into, let's say, the sandy deserts of Arabia. The Byzantine Empire ended up weakened because of the Crusades, and there was great enmity between the East and the Western churches. The positives? Well, in Western Europe, the economy was benefited from all of the riches flowing in from the East. Also, there was additional cultural exposure to the things that were going on in the East, which were in a better state than in the West. And also the tribesmen in the West and the kingdoms fought fewer wars against each other because they were concerned with going and fighting against the Muslims. Consequences that came out of this, well, the papacy gains power, and it also develops this doctrine of indulgences. That is, if you go on this crusade, then the Pope will, using his authority of the keys, limit or even get rid of your time that you have to spend in the purifying fire of purgatory. During this time, in the West, you have to understand that art fell into, if you're just trying to survive after the collapse of the empire and the invasion of various barbarian tribes, right? The time that you would spend for the more liberal pursuits, such as poetry and art, may suffer until it starts to build back up again. Yet, nevertheless, even though the scholars and the thinkers of the Enlightenment love to call the Middle Ages completely dark all the way through, we know that art started to get a footing again, and the Renaissance didn't come from nowhere, but in fact, especially south of the Alps, they were continuing to hone their crafts and to develop their understanding of how the ancients did things, so that when the Renaissance finally did happen, it wasn't something that was like a lightning strike out of the blue, but it was the end result of a long development of artistic development from the real Dark Ages until the 1400s. Also realized that the architecture did amazing things during the Middle Ages, especially when it came to the construction of these beautiful Gothic-style cathedrals throughout Western Europe. These were built at a time when people were assumed to be very, very ignorant and dull, and yet they built these magnificent structures that we still stand in awe of today, to the glory and the praise of God. We mentioned before the Fourth Lateran Council. This helped to make Roman Catholicism how I see it and understand it today. It was also a key time in history because it represented the apex of papal power under Innocent III. The Fourth Lateran Council is one of the last things that he did, and yet it showed sort of the extent and the reach of papal power over the Western world. And by the way, Innocent III's time as Pope was marked by many encroachments into political affairs, raising kings up and throwing them down. Here, transubstantiation and the sacrifice of the Mass became dogma. We mentioned this before. The Christians were commanded to confess and to receive communion once a year. There is no more lay investiture. That is, that it is the church and the church only that can appoint men into sacred office. This also represented a kind of reformation and regulation of the life of those members of the clergy who belonged to the church. Instead of there being general chaos, now everything is brought under the authority, the power, and the direction of the Pope. It is at this council, interestingly enough, that the Pope is no longer known as the Vicar of Peter or the stand-in of Peter, the chief among the apostles, but now he becomes the vicar of Christ. He alone is Christ's representative to the earth. And so the bishops no longer represent Christ to their congregations. Only the Pope does, and the bishops represent the Pope. Now, scholasticism is the way in which academic theology was done in the Middle Ages, and this is marked by a logical, dialectical method of doing theology. A question was posed, there were arguments posed against it, arguments posed for it. The correct answer is then presented once both sides of the debate are given their fair shake, right? It seems like a very healthy way, in fact, to do scholarship, I would say. It was unafraid of using reason and logic in service to theology, which was known as the Queen of the Sciences. It integrated Neoplatonic theology that came from the patristic era together with the newly discovered Aristotelian thought preserved by Islam in the East. The centers of scholasticism in Europe were Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. And Peter Lombard's sentences represent sort of the kicking off stage of this compilation of theological, churchly, Christian wisdom, and many of the scholastic doctors that came after him would do commentaries on his sentences, on his topics of theology. There were commentaries also that were done not only on Peter Lombard and his sentences, but also commentaries that were done on the works of philosophers, theologians like St. Augustine or whatever. Also, during this time, what were fairly common and popular were golden chain commentaries. You could still find Thomas Aquinas's golden chain, his commentary on the Gospels, where it's not so much his words and his thoughts. What he does is he gathers up a bunch of quotes from various church fathers and earlier medieval church fathers and theologians and compiles them together. So as you study a pericope or a cutout of the scripture, you have right underneath that not only, let's say, what St. Augustine said, but what St. Ambrose said, what Jerome said, etc., etc. By the way, this is a handy tool also for today's pastors as they prepare to preach a particular text. St. Anselm of Canterbury is one of my favorite theologians in the Middle Ages. He was a forerunner of scholasticism. He was appointed Bishop of Canterbury in England at 1093. He was often exiled because he ran afoul of the political leadership there, but he was a prolific writer. Especially, you might know of these works, his Proslogion or Prolegomena, right? Why God Became Man, Cur Deus Homo, where he gave rational theological explanations for why it was absolutely necessary that God become a man in the person of Christ, and it is so that he could be an acceptable sacrifice for the sin of the world, right? He also delved into the mysterious topics of predestination, of divine foreknowledge, etc. When he talks, sometimes you hear St. Anselm referenced with regard to his is a faith-seeking understanding, and this is what he himself says about it, which helps us to understand that it's not like he's trying to escape from faith, so now he knows everything rationally. That's not it at all. Let's see how he speaks. I do not try, Lord, and he's speaking to the Lord in prayer, to attain your lofty heights, because my understanding is in no way equal to it. But I do desire to understand your truth a little. That though that my heart believes and loves, that through that my heart believes and loves. For I do not seek to understand so that I may believe, but I believe so that I may understand. For I believe this also, that unless I believe, I shall not understand. So faith precedes understanding of especially theological truths and topics. So he well articulated, by the way, the vicarious satisfactory atonement. In fact, some people will say that the vicarious satisfaction of Christ is in fact what they call a theory originated by and made popular by St. Anselm. I don't believe that. If you read the fathers like Ambrose, if you read Augustine, if you read Athanasius, it quickly becomes apparent that all of the fathers had a vicarious, satisfactory understanding of Jesus' death on the cross. And so it was only because of 20th century Swedish theologians who pit various quote-unquote theories of the atonement against one another, that this idea that Anselm developed one particular kind of theory of the atonement, and this is what most of the West was trapped under until more recent understandings. I think that's a false narrative. That's not a really good story. This became apparent to me during my study at the seminary, and it continues to be apparent to me today as I read the Fathers and seek to understand how they thought about Jesus' death on the cross. He's also very popular and well known because of his ontological argument, and that is an a priori argument that God's existence is a kind of necessary consequence if you understand the meaning of the word God and, let's say, existence. If I ever try to do like a philosophy series, maybe we'll go into the ontological argument. I think I would butcher it and sin against philosophy and philosophers everywhere if I try to articulate it just right now in this episode. But what the heck, I'll do it anyways. All right, so God is the greatest conceivable being. It is greater to exist than not to exist. Therefore, God exists. Ontologically satisfied, everybody? Maybe not. But hey, I actually like this argument a lot. I could get into my reasons for that later, but let's move on. St. Thomas Aquinas, like I said, my favorite medieval theologian. He's sometimes called the angelic doctor because of the heavenly angelic topics that he would take up, talking about the spiritual nature of the angels, right? He mastered integrating Aristotelian categories and terms into his scholastic method. Especially check out his book, or his commentary on Being and Essence. Very, very good. It's an Aristotelian work, and he does a commentary on it, and there he develops what became very popular a way of thinking of our existence and our whatness, and applying that and seeing what that means with regard to God and with regard to the angels and with regard to the creatures. And this still continues to be the working vocabulary and metaphysics of the Roman Church and much of the Western Church today. He also articulated reasons placed beside faith to serve our faith, much in the way of St. Anselm. And he used reason to articulate arguments for the existence of God. Now, whereas St. Anselm's argument was a priori, or it wasn't based upon experience, Thomas Aquinas' arguments are based on experience, so they a posteriori. And so, let's see. Am I going to butcher some more philosophical arguments? Yes, I will. Here's an example of one of his arguments. Every effect has a cause. This is just demonstrably truth or experience. Now, either everything is there's a chain of causation that stretches back infinitely, right? Or every effect, it could be traced back to an initial cause, and that cause is what we call God, right? And that's an argument from causation. He also has an argument from motion. He has a moral argument or gradations of being argument. Sometimes those two things are conflated or said to be the same. That would make for a good episode someday, to talk about the 5 arguments of God's existence. Except all of you philosophers who are out there listening in, if you are listening in, you'd be cringing and grabbing at your brain as I butchered your very precise terminologies and arguments. So, all right, let's talk about his compiled, expansive masterwork of theology called the Summa Theologica. It is an attempt to deal with everything that could possibly come up with regard to theology. And here he deals with every single question with his particular scholastic method. Oftentimes he'll say, it seems that, and there will be the contrary or the wrong position. And then he'll give reasons for that wrong position that came from heretics or errorists. Then he'll say, on the other hand, and there's this great turn. And then he'll have answering arguments for each of the false arguments above, and a conclusion, and you conclude in the right place, right? Also, it's sometimes thought that he developed this understanding of substantial grace, that grace is like a stuff that's kind of plugged into you, and it fixes you, and that's how you begin your upward journey towards God. I don't think that's That's absolutely right. Rather, it's more like St. Thomas Aquinas recognized that sin is a corruption of our souls, and our souls are real things, right? They're immaterial things, and yet they're real things. And when God gives us His grace, His mercy, when He saves us, He restores something of our souls that had been corrupted and gutted out and made dead because of sin, which enables us to love God, to fear Him, to trust in Him. That enables us also to strive after holiness and good works, when before we were doing nothing that was pleasing to God, right? What I would say as a Lutheran is this totally goes together with our Lutheran doctrine of sanctification in the narrow sense, but we can't speak about a reparation of nature as our justification. Rather, we know from the Scriptures, and especially Romans chapter 3, that justification is on account of God's declaration of righteousness. He calls us righteous on account of Jesus' death and resurrection, not because of something that has been made perfect within ourselves, right? Okay, so he also gave philosophical articulation to the doctrine of transubstantiation through his Aristotelian language, terminology, metaphysics, etc. William of Ockham. He is a nominalist. What is a nominalist? You philosophers out there pulling out your hair. I don't care. I'm just going to tell you what a nominalist is, and you can accept it or not, or argue with me in the notes. That would be fun, by the way, arguing with me. A nominalist is someone who says that the universals do not have an existence independent of the things themselves. In other words, we have these universals like goodness or beauty or humanity. And the nominalists against the realists would say, yeah, those are just names that we have come up with to explain commonalities that we observe in distinct individuals. It's not like there's something out there like goodness or beauty or humanity. A realist, on the other hand, would say, no, there is such a thing as humanity, and it's by virtue of our participation in humanity that I'm a man, and my brother's a man, and my dad's a man, and my friends or other people on the other side of the world. We all participate in the same thing, and its existence isn't something that's just kind of floating around mysteriously out there. But especially after who was it? Peter Abelard. This existence was in the mind of God, right? He intended humanity to be a thing that was definitive for all of the individual members of humanity. All right. Now, this older realist philosophy of universals quickly became pretty heavy philosophically. It started to carry a lot of baggage. Critical questions were asked of it, and it seemed like this realism really became very, very complicated and nuanced if it wanted to win the day. And so Occam said, why do we have to do that? Let's just say that the universals are just categories and names that we assign to things that we observe to be common, right? It's not something that exists out there. It's just something that's a function of our language. All right. Now, you philosophers out there, if you want to clarify any of this, please, by all means, right? All right. He studied at Oxford. He was persecuted at Avignon. Remember, we'll talk about the Babylonian captivity a little bit later. That's where the papacy was in Avignon for a while, right? Where it was dominated by the French Curia. He taught in Munich, but he was protected by the Holy Roman Emperor. He is the father of the Via Moderna, the new way of doing theology that was against the excesses of the older realism, sometimes what's called the Via Antiqua. And you know of Occam from the term Occam's razor. If you can explain something in a much more simplified, clear way, then go with that as opposed to the much more complicated and extraneous way to explain something philosophically, right? The three estates. Well, social life in the Middle Ages, and this pertains to life in the church, was at least in the minds of some rigidly separated into those who fight, those who labor, and those who pray. That last one should be those who pray. That's use my mouse here. So that's a mistake. It should be those who pray. And this threefold division of society came by virtue of various oaths that were sworn by the workers to be faithful and obedient to their lords, who also swear an oath to protect those who were working their land. And of course, you had those who swore to be impoverished, chaste, and obedient to the religious rule. And they served the other two estates through their prayers, divine service, and spiritual works. Now, why this matters for us as we talk about the history of theology is you have to understand there's a sharp distinction between the spirituals, those members of the spiritual class, and the laity. And it was understood and taught that only those who were spirituals, who had taken these meritorious oaths of chastity, poverty, and obedience, could expect, to gain saving grace and then to spend far less time in the purging fire of purgatory. And that's why monasticism in the West was a very popular institution. What about monasticism in the West? Remember, this is life defined by one of these spiritual rules. After you had taken your oaths, it was defined by, in the West, after the Benedictine model, praying 7 hours, vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, and compline. And so you can imagine these monks waking up in the middle of the night to go and pray. It was also marked by continuous reading of the Holy Scriptures and praying of the Psalter. And we have to say this about the monasteries during the Middle Ages. During times of war and of plague, this is where the written knowledge of civilization was preserved. You also had military orders, not just praying orders, but men who joined a kind of militant monasticism. Those of you who are into the lore of, let's say, the Teutonic Knights or the Knights Templar would know more about that. Isn't there some question as to like the real Christianity of the Knights Templar? Like they were some, I don't know. You read this in all these like dumb adventure, thriller, novels that the Knights Templar is like some kind of secret Gnostic society. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys know more about that or believe that. There are various monastic Reformation movements that happened throughout the Middle Ages to standardize and to purify the excesses and the abuses of monasticism. The Cluniac Reform, the Cistercians, who were like Puritan Benedictines, and then there were the Carthusians. It turns out the monasticism, as it's spelled out on paper, is very pure and noble and holy sounding, but human nature being what it is, many men who entered into the holy orders quickly found themselves abusing it as opposed to keeping it, as you can imagine, right? Also during the Middle Ages, you don't only have cloistered monks, but you also have monks who became mendicant, or they started walking around and they were bringing religion to society. Two great examples of this would be the Order of Preachers, the Dominicans, to whom St. Thomas Aquinas belonged. It was part of their monasticism not to be holed up behind closed doors, but rather to preach and to teach and to bring Christianity to the understanding of the lay people. And then also you had the Franciscans, who didn't cloister themselves behind closed doors, but spent their time in care of the poor. Finally, what we're going to talk about is the Babylonian captivity. Remember that the papacy is gathering and amassing power, and it is even dictating to the temporal governments how they should conduct themselves, who should be king, who should not be king, who should be ruling and not. And this is, of course, butting up against the temporal rulers who see themselves as having their own purview of authority, which is right, by the way. And so finally, this comes to a head when King Philip the Fourth seizes Pope Boniface and imprisons him. Boniface escapes and he returns to Rome, and he dies shortly thereafter. But at that point, the damage had been done. The French take advantage of their power over the papacy to appoint French cardinals The papacy is moved out of Rome and to Avignon in France, and you have a series of French popes there who are hand in hand with the French temporal powers. Now this leads to the Great Schism, when the Romans say that, well, this is the real seat of St. Peter, Rome, and so they raise up their own pope, and for a while you have two different sets of, or you have two different sets of popes, those who came more from Rome and those who came more from France, until finally, through the gathering of various councils, the issue was resolved, and we return to one pope who resides in Rome. During this time, people became dismayed over the extreme power that the popes were claiming for themselves over spiritual and temporal affairs, and so this movement called conciliarism aimed to rein in the pope's power and to say that the chief spiritual power in the church was in fact that of a council and not of the pope. An example of a conciliarist gathering would be the Council of Constance in 1414, where, by the way, John Huss was burned at the stake for being a forerunner of the godly reformation of the church. And thereafter, later councils, sadly, were unable to rein in the Pope's power and his tyrannical abuse of the church, and through wielding the bureaucracy that was at his command. All right, I've gone on for quite a long time today, folks, and we did our best to give you just sort of a brief outline to at least introduce you to some of the topics and the personalities and the movements of the medieval church. Really, I could spend 10 weeks getting into much more depth and speaking about the medieval church. Maybe that would be a good idea sometime soon to go through that. Maybe some of you would find that very interesting. I don't know. Let me know in the comments or shoot me an email or something like that, and I would love to hear your thoughts about that. For now, we'll just remember that next time when we're getting together, we're going to be talking about the Reformation, humanism, and the Renaissance. Good topics all around. All right, folks, until next time, God's peace.